You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. How goes it?
It's going good. How's it going for you?
It's just another day in paradise, like I always say. So today's topic is very interesting, and it's what's the difference between mold and mycotoxins? Do you know the difference?
Well, I'm assuming I do, because I hear about it so much, but I think lots of people are confusing the two as if they're the same when one is the product of the other.
Exactly. To me, it's like saying what's the difference between the parents and the children?
Or the chicken and the egg.
Yeah, you could look at it that way,
Well, no,
too.
then that wouldn't be quite right, actually, no.
It would. The chicken produces the egg, same like the mold produces the mycotoxin. But mold is a fungus that grows in multicellular filaments called hyphae. My clients, our listeners, have heard me talk about hyphae. Mold is naturally present in homes, outside. It's everywhere. That's what, when things decay, that's part of how they decay is mold. Mold's eating it, so it gets rid of it. Inside of your home, that's when we have issues because we have mold types inside of a home that are eating building materials, which are toxic. But then what's a mycotoxin? That is the toxic compound produced by the toxigenic mold species. So you have a toxic mold species. They can produce, and I say can, if it's a toxigenic mold, they're capable of producing it. They don't always do it. They can produce a mycotoxin. Then that mycotoxin is what people are exposed to, and that's what makes them sick.
Absolutely. So the mold really is naturally present in the air, and the mold, when it is toxigenic. So then let me ask a different question, actually. Can a non-toxigenic mold, so an allergenic or pathogenic mold, produce mycotoxins?
Technically or scientifically, no.
Okay.
It has to be a toxigenic mold.
So it has to be like Stachybotrys. Is Chaetomium toxigenic mold?
But even common molds like Aspergillus, Penicillium, those can all be, the species can be a toxigenic species. Meaning, when we do traditional mold testing, we're only testing, and that's why it's the cheapest, we're only being reported to the mold type, which is Aspergillus, Penicillium, Cladosporium, Chaetomium. Then you have a mold species that is what determines whether it's allergenic, pathogenic, or toxigenic.
Okay, and if the species is toxigenic species are the only ones who can produce mycotoxins.
Exactly.
So should somebody then assume, if they have done testing and the testing determines that there is a toxigenic mold species present, should they assume that mycotoxins are also present?
I would.
Okay.
I mean, to me, it's almost like, well, has the skunk ever released its spray? Probably.
Okay.
Does that make sense? And so to backtrack just a little bit for our listeners, every test has its purpose. That's why traditional mold testing, which only defines the mold type, that's why it's never that accurate. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Because most mold types have species that can be toxic.
Okay.
And if you do traditional mold testing, you're not going to know the mold species.
Exactly.
The types of tests that would define the actual species would be like an ERMI test or an EMA test. And it's what we call qPCR.
So the qPCR, but not all qPCRs are mycotoxin testing, right?
None of them are.
None of them are. Okay, so then
Well, an EMA test includes a mycotoxin test.
It includes, okay, so because I think if I'm somebody who's listening and doesn't know a lot about this, where I'm getting lost right now is in all the testing. So I call somebody and I say, I want mold and mycotoxin testing. What tests am I actually asking for?
So you would be asking for qPCR testing, which is a mold species test.
Okay.
And you'd be asking for a mycotoxin test.
Okay.
Which is EMA, Hayes Microbial, and Respiratory Labs. Those are the 3 labs that I'm aware of that can do mycotoxin testing. Just so our listeners understand, they are 2 different things. You don't test for, I want to be clear this way, you can test, like an EMA test is mold and mycotoxins, but it's 2 different reports.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does, but I'm just thinking like tape lifts.
No.
Air testing, do those give you data on the species level of mold?
Not typically, no.
Oh.
That's what we would call traditional mold testing.
So traditional mold testing doesn't even go down to the species, which wouldn't even hint to you whether or not mycotoxins might be a factor.
Exactly.
So then really people should be doing comprehensive mold testing, which may start with some traditional air testing, but it can't stop there.
Exactly.
Okay.
And once again, every situation's different. So let's say our listener, they hire me. I come to their home. I do traditional mold testing. We do some air testing. We take some tape lifts. If we don't find visible mold, we wouldn't do a bulk sample. A bulk sample's like cutting out a piece of sheetrock and sending that to the lab. If we did traditional mold testing, and it comes back and everything looks fine. When I say fine, we don't have standards per se. I would say, okay, here are the next steps. Once again, that's doing traditional testing. There's no concerns. No fusarium, no chaetomium, no Stachybotrys. But if we did do the traditional testing and we see there's Stachy, which Stachybotrys is black mold, which most people think that's the only toxic mold. Not true at all. Let's say we find that, well, automatically I know there's a concern. So does that make sense? Mm-hmm. A traditional mold test is the most common because it's the cheapest. Most companies, everybody's different, but they're going to charge between $30 or $40 a sample up to $100 for traditional. Whereas if we do qPCR testing, that's an EMA, that's a ERMI, those tests are way more expensive. Like an EMA is $450.
So just a question about that, because I noticed that lots of people are taking it upon themselves to do a ton of self-testing. So people are running around in Facebook groups doing, I did another EMA test, and I did another EMA test, and I did another
I'll just stop you there.
test.
They don't do an EMA. I always see ERMI. Hardly any of them do EMA, which is weird.
But we're living in a time where, and I am one of those people who wants my own health data, and I want to be able to track, because I definitely know better than my doctors. Because most doctors are just on an iPad trying to look it up using AI. But most people are getting to be like me in the sense of when they hear things like EMA and ERMI, they go, okay, I don't have to call a mold specialist. I will just go get a EMA kit, an ERMI kit, and I'm just going to run it myself. But just speak to that. Like, how does that help them?
Well, I think initially, I don't think that's a bad thing. But on the other hand, you're probably going to have to, no matter what, you're going to have to get an IEP involved. Indoor environmental professional, call them a mold specialist. They can be whatever you want to call it. There's all sorts of different terms. My point is at the end of the day, you're going to have to get an IEP involved. So in my opinion, you might as well do that right off the bat. And I get it. Like, there's plenty of us out there that do it. Some are better than others. Some specialize in other things. I understand it. Like, we're not cheap. But if you're trying to go the cheapest route and do it all on your own, going back to your question, so let's say you do your own ERMI or you do your own EMA, which both of them you can do on your own. When you get the results, do you know what you're even looking at?
Well, that's the problem. There's no education that comes along with the test results.
Exactly. You can try to do all the research and everything on your own. And I'm not saying this to attack any of our listeners, but unless they've done this for 20, 30 years, like someone like myself has, you're not going to have enough research in, a few months to meet the level of experience and expertise that I have. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. So what do you recommend people do if they are concerned about mold and or mycotoxins and wondering if that is what's making them sick?
You should start with an IEP. Beyond that, as an IEP, I'm going to recommend different things based on their circumstances. If they know they have a visible mold problem, I'm going to tell them, like, there's no reason to waste, and it's not wasting my time, but there's no reason for the client to waste their money by paying me to tell them they need remediation. I'm going to tell them, go get remediation done. Then let's move to the next step. Those next steps could be medical testing, could be mycotoxin testing, could be many things. So depending on the situation, that's the road I would take them down.
Don't you think people need to assemble their mold team? Meaning an IEP, a mold literate doctor, and then maybe other practitioners. But I sometimes it seems like people, when they have mold issues, they want one person to solve it, whether that's the mold literate doctor or that's the IEP. And I don't think something like mold gets solved just by having one person.
No, and one key player in that is the remediation company. And, our listeners, if they've been listening for a while, know this. Like, I'm a certified mold remediation contractor, and I'm a certified mold inspector. Most IEPs have probably never done remediation. I understand the remediation side of things. Doesn't make me any better than anybody else. It's just that's one of the perks for me as an IEP. But you're correct. You should assemble a team of people that know what they're doing. And it's hard. Like you said, a traditional doctor is just going to, get on their device. And I don't want to attack all of them, but they're going to get on their device and, use whatever AI program that they use and type in what their patient's telling them, and they're going to just tell you what they see. If you go to someone like Dr. Diane or Dr. Fox or Schumacher, Dr. Jill, like there are physicians that specialize in mold. Those people are not cheap, but you're going to have to bring those kinds of people on. Me personally, as much experience I have on the blue collar side of it, I have no clue. I mean, I shouldn't say I have no clue. I've interviewed doctors, but I can't help you with the medical side, nor can your doctor help you with my side of things.
Correct. Even if you're working with the doctor who insists that the only thing you need is ERMI.
Exactly.
You still need
Which is probably the most common thing I deal with.
You still need a support team. And I think that's why you have interviewed doctors like Dr. Fox, like Dr. Diane. I think that's why you interviewed a health coach, because every person dealing with mold is going to need a number of different people, and their support team from person to person will look totally different.
Yeah. And it's very difficult because, even in my profession, I deal with other professionals that don't even think mold can make you sick, that are, project managers or owners of restoration companies. So it's very difficult to get the proper team put together. And I think for our listeners, that's where it's frustrating for them. They're like, well, Steve's not in New York or he's not in Virginia or wherever. I get it. But But on the other hand, there are professionals that are in those areas. Now, we obviously offer, virtual inspections, consultations. Like, I can work with anybody across the world. But on the other hand, it is very difficult for our listeners to get the proper team together because it's so expensive.
Absolutely. But what's the cost of your health?
Exactly.
And not having the proper team.
Yeah.
You need people who actually believe what you believe about the severity and the importance of dealing with mold. And I think what a lot of people do is they sort of pick up people, whether it's because of price or proximity, but the people they put on their mold squad don't really believe mold is an issue. Well, you're not going to get good results if who you're surrounding yourself with, whether they tell you or not. They just think that you are blowing this out of proportion. People who are going to gaslight you about mold, you probably don't want on your support team.
Yeah. And I think for me, that's why I have the reputation I have and I have the clients that I have is they know they can come to me, and I don't know it all. We all have tons to learn, but I'm pretty well versed in many aspects of the mold industry. And, for me, I can help them go down the right paths. And even if they have a GP that's not really mold literate, they might have a GP that believes in them and believes that mold can make them sick. And I can recommend different things, even on the medical side.
Correct.
Once again, I'm not a medical professional, but I guess my point is I'm not the only IEP out there that has that knowledge. There are other ones out there, but it's important to find the proper people. And if you find the right IEP, they might be able to save you a bunch of time and money, wasting time with other professionals, whether it's remediators, doctors, or whatever. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. So going back to mold and mycotoxins, what's your call to action for people?
So if you do think, most common question I get is my home making me sick? Do a quick inspection of your home. You don't have to hire me for a VPA. Do an inspection of your home. Look for water damage. We talked about equipment last week. Buy some humidity gauges. Put them in your bathrooms. There are things that our listeners can do to get ahead of the game so that when they reach out to an IEP, hopefully me, they've already got the humidity gauges. They've already done, routine inspections. That will save our listeners a bunch of money if they get ahead of that.
Awesome.
Make sense?
It does.
As I always say, clear as mud, right?
Yes, exactly.
Like I mentioned earlier, we have consultations. We have consultations that include VPAs and EMA testing. Like, we have a ton of different services. So go to our website, cnccontractorservices.com, and go through it, browse it, and see what you think suits you best. If you're not sure, send us an email at info@cnccontractorservices.com. That'll get to me. We'll recommend whatever services that we think's most beneficial.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we appreciate all of you. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also, on cnccontractorservices.com, find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.